a researcher I know, they have documented 12,700 individual protests against energy and food price increases, mainly
Wow.
energy. This is
Wow.
this is the
Okay.
thing of our time. So there's a two-way thing happening here.
Hmm.
And the
Okay,
other
but
thing
since when, by the way?
that was between 21 and 22.
Okay, wow. Okay,
So
crazy.
it's and in 90 countries. So this
Okay.
is huge elsewhere as well. But I
Okay.
think it's interesting that I mean no one covers it. I'm like, why
Yeah.
doesn't the Guardian cover that? Why doesn't the Norwegian media cover that? But they
Yeah.
celebrate Tinubu removing the subsidy and end of story.
So today we are joined by a guest that has been much anticipated by us, and I think by a few of the people who know us and listen to the show. Um, and that is Camilla Houeland, who is a researcher at Fafo, Norway, and an associate professor in sociology and human geography at the University of Oslo. And amongst her other interests, she focuses on trade unions, labor and climate change, and has had a long-term research and political, I think I could say, engagement with Nigeria. So Camilla, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation now.
Yeah, it's kind of been a long time coming, I think. Um, and yeah, it's like various labor related things, scheduling has been crucial, but not always on our side. So it's really great to have you, and it's good that it's finally worked out. Um, so I have attempted a brief introduction of you, but actually, I think for our listeners, it'd be interesting to hear a little more about your research and engagement with the question of subsidy politics in Nigeria and labor unions. So, yeah, could you tell us a bit more about your research and then maybe where the issue of the subsidy might fit in?
Sure. I think it all started. First time I came to Nigeria was in 2005.
Mm.
Then interested in oil and Norwegian oil company engagement in the Niger Delta, and it really struck me and stayed with me. And I started
Mm.
working as an Africa advisor in the trade unions later, and had engagement and communication with the Nigerian Labour Congress and the oil worker unions. And I found generally that there was a complete difference between my experience of a powerful union
Mm.
and a complete lack of talk about unions in development and Africa circles in Norway
Mm.
and elsewhere. So I applied for a PhD, and the idea then was to explore the specific power and agency of the Nigerian Union given the political economy of oil.
Mm.
So, and I say power and agency as two different things because it's a little bit important here, because
Okay.
to me, power is kind of inherent capabilities, whereas agency is more subjective about the willingness to use these capabilities. So
Okay.
I'm a bit interested in both in what is the kind of structural possibilities of a union and how do they strategize in using them.
Mm.
And this, I got the PhD in 2011, and this is only 3 months before January uprising
Mm.
or Occupy Nigeria. So I completely shifted my PhD to center around the subsidy and trying to understand the union's role in it and why the subsidies were so important to the unions.
Mm.
And since then, I followed the politics of fuel subsidies and Nigerian unions.
Mm.
Yeah,
Okay, excellent. I mean, yeah, so it sounds like the subsidy politics, the questions of subsidy and politics are fairly central to your research interests, actually. Um,
absolutely.
okay, excellent. And I think, yeah, we may come back to the question of power and agency later, because that sounds quite fascinating. Um, but I think we should probably start in terms of the substantive bit of the conversation with a fairly basic question, maybe. And it's one that, I mean, some people will be aware of, but maybe not in as much detail as you might. So, I mean, it might be a tough one to kind of summarize very quickly, but we're going to put you on the spot and see if you can do that. So basically, the question is, why did Nigeria institute a fuel subsidy to begin with? And I guess what would you say is the origin also of the pressure to remove the subsidy, which is really where the conversation that we've been having on this show have picked up?
I think on the first one, I wish I had read original kind of policy documents from the politicians that be. I've been reading a lot of history sources, and they actually don't agree when they started these subsidies. But let's say late 60s, early 70s, depending on the sources. It was decided to have cheap fuel. And in the literature, it says it was to give something back to the Nigerians in times of oil production peaking. But I think it's also important that this is in a time of still some kind of development optimism, and a time where the developmental state was the key thing. And during the 70s, money poured in to the Nigerian state from oil at the time when they actually built some kind of welfare state. Not necessarily like my own Norwegian super welfare state, but at least building an education system, a health system that was relatively accessible, relatively free, and subsidies was part of that kind of big political plan.
Okay. No, that's interesting. And I guess that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Because I think also the relative significance of subsidy is also important, because when the first attempt to reduce the price in 78, there was no protest. That was under Obasanjo's first presidency. And my hypothesis is that it didn't make so much difference because there was relatively high levels of welfare in. So that's I don't know if I'm right, but I think I'm right on that one. And the pressure to remove it, that was also since 78 and onwards, because the Nigerian subsidies, and it's important also to mention that this is a very common thing to do for oil producing countries, to subsidize fuel for its citizens, not least in the Middle East and many North African countries. The US has done this, etc., etc. But the Nigerian way of doing it is that there is no inbuilt mechanism to adjust prices. And when the market prices internationally go up, the expenses for subsidies will go up. And there is no real mechanism of adjusting prices. And historically, this is where labor comes in. The protest has been a way of securing continued subsidies, but also a way of adjusting prices. If that makes sense. So and that kind of disappears a bit from the Nigerian conversation, because the pressure of removing it has been there since before the big IMF and structural adjustment program, but it was in the same time, because this became more and more expensive at a time when the state had, during the 70s, also overexpended. And there was a crisis, and we can discuss why this was a crisis, blah, 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 and whether the suggested remedy from the IMF of saving money and cutting cost was a very good one. But at least that was the idea, both from the Nigerian elites and presidents, and pressure, not least from the IMF in handling the loans that came after the 70s expenditure and the economic
Yeah.
collapse.
Right.
So it has been a way of saving money, basically. To remove the subsidy has been throughout history a way of saving state money. That has
Right.
been also the reason why it's being removed now, because it's expensive.
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, so the pressure has come from the international community, developing partners, IMF, World Bank, the
Yeah.
economic elites, etc. And in that regard, it's been kind of amazing that this kind of powerful pressure of removing subsidies that have been called inefficient and environmentally unfriendly, and like you discussed last episode, that it's supposedly going only to the elites and the upper middle classes. But labor and poor people have resisted this consistently since 1980s through
Right.
strike and protest.
And actually, that's a question we want to come back to in a moment, the question of resistance, because I know it's, even as you were saying in the introduction, quite a central part of the work you do on the subsidy. I'm fascinated by two aspects of what you were saying. The first being around the pricing mechanism, that is often associated with subsidy regimes elsewhere, but not exactly in Nigeria. And also the question of like the oil boom and bust cycle, which seems central to the pricing question, right? Because as you're describing, like the 70s when the subsidy expanded initially, the early 70s were a period where oil prices were high. So Nigeria was reaping quite, like a substantial revenue from the sale of crude, but at the same time had to buy oil since like the capacity to refine sufficient amounts of crude oil to meet domestic demand was not in place. And then, by the end of the 70s, as you're describing with the Obasanjo regime, when the oil price had collapsed, suddenly the government was facing, new pressures that it hadn't necessarily anticipated at the start of the boom. And one of the, kind of seemingly most obvious, like cost-saving arenas in the budget was the subsidy. So I guess, yeah, that highlights the question you're raising, or the issue you're raising about the pricing. And I guess, not to get too technical, but just maybe in very general terms, like what are the other kinds of sort of pricing mechanisms that might exist in countries that have subsidies that we don't quite have in Nigeria? I just wonder, even if in just kind of broad strokes, whether you could help paint a picture for us of what that might look like.
As I understand it, it's linked to market prices, so that when market prices goes up, the price of fuel will also go up, but not necessarily be equal to the market price.
Okay. So it's like some kind of fair adjustment.
Some kind of adjustment. Yeah.
Right.
And it will always be, I've been reading a lot of global reports on the development of fuel subsidies, and it's been celebrated every now and again, like after the oil boom that lasted until 2014-15, suddenly prices went down, and international consultants and the IMF will say now is a good time to remove the subsidies.
Sure.
But basically that means that the consumers won't notice, because you take away the subsidy, because there's no need for any subsidies, because the market prices and the subsidized prices have leveled out.
Right.
But what happens in practice is then when prices go up again, because the market goes up, then the protest may come. So So IMF says that the most difficult thing with removing these inefficient subsidies is popular protest, because the subsidies are very popular,
Right.
especially in countries where there's low welfare state. And yeah.
Well, and I mean that leads right on to one of the big questions, that we're very interested in, which is about popular protest and the ways in which popular protests emerge or don't emerge in response to subsidy removals. So I've noticed in your work that one kind of crucial moment for you, and you mentioned this earlier, as even coinciding with the start of your PhD, was the 2012 general strike in Nigeria, which also is known or seemed to coincide with what was at the time called the Occupy Nigeria protests. And these took place right after the announcement was made by the federal government on January 1st, I believe, 2012, that the subsidies would no longer exist, basically. And yeah, instantaneously, or pretty shortly thereafter, the price of petroleum products, particularly like fuel for cars, increased dramatically. So, I mean, I think what was striking was how quickly the labor movement and a lot of civil society and youth groups responded, both physically in terms of like mass mobilizations onto the street, and digitally, and in some ways, a lot of people date the kind of birth of Nigerian kind of online protest culture to Occupy. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, using Occupy as maybe a window into these subsidy protests, I suppose it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from you about, firstly, like why Occupy happened, and then, what its legacies were, and maybe, I mean, was Occupy, was it unique or new or different in any way? What makes that moment, I think, like of particular interest to you? And
that's a big few questions.
yeah. Try to load them up all at once.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short and say in many ways there are three stories here. One is the labor story, that since trade unions in Nigeria have on a regular basis resisted and protested fuel subsidy removals, especially since the 80s.
Sure.
And a lot of people don't associate 1993 and all the protests around the lost elections of June 12, etc. All these things were actually interconnected with fuel subsidy protest as
That's
a key ingredient of that. And then there was a long period of no strike and no protest because of the Abacha regime and the imprisonment of union leaders and opposition, etc. And then we have democracy coming up in 1999. And between 1999 and 2007, there were no less than 6 strikes led by the NLC against fuel subsidy removals, where Adam Soshiomola, now the APC, was a key figure and a leader of the unions. So
yeah,
for labor,
a close friend of Emeka's as well, I should say. So
yes, but for unions, 2012 was just kind of a continuance of a long history of subsidy strikes and labor strike and resistance against subsidy removal. But there also happens this new generation which with less ties to unions and also fewer ideas and historical remembering of the strikes, that saw this as a new thing. So for me, when I've been talking to people in all sides, it was almost like there were parallel events that from the outside looked like a massive coordinated protest. But when you talk to people, it seems like a disorganized strike and protest with many actors
Right.
that had different reasons and different means and different organizational systems to go into this. If that somehow makes sense. So 2012 was different in the setup and in the actors involved. There was a new generation. It was often talked about like the youth and Twitter generation, social media, and many of those did not have that kind of history with unions. And then you have, but there's also another thing because it was talked about as a sudden thing when
Yeah.
Goodluck Jonathan on January 1st announced now it is removed, the subsidy.
Sure.
But it had been announced in October, the removal of the subsidy. And Occupy Nigeria had already been formed. So there were the unions declared in October that they will resist, like they always had. So it was a prepared system. And Occupy had already started preparing. And the resistance and announced threat of strike led the government then to initiate a dialogue process. This dialogue process was also fragmented. They had dialogue with unions, they had dialogue with different civil society organizations, but it was announced to happen in April. So it was still a very surprise to Nigerians. It was not a surprise that it would be removed, but when it was removed and how it was removed.
Sure. So there was an element of shock, you could say.
An element of shock. You also discussed this last episode, this kind of sudden shock therapy. And if you ask about why did it happen at this time, there's a lot of speculation on the Minister of Finance being out of the country and the Minister of Oil and Energy pushing the agenda to speed up, because maybe the Oil and Energy Minister would actually benefit from not removing it. This is all speculation, but I think it's interesting because it's also who benefits. What you did not discuss so much last episode was you talked about the benefit of cheap oil from a class perspective. Is it the poor or the workers or the middle classes and the rich?
Yeah.
But the system of subsidy, there's also a lot of corruption.
Sure.
And very, very strong interest in the NNPC and in the oil complex as such of keeping the subsidies, because there are individuals who get access to a lot of corruption and lots of money through the system. So
no, absolutely. I mean, I think the subsidy, in a sense, or at least a part of it, maybe might belong in what we call the scam hall of fame here, because surely there are aspects of it that, I think the polite way of putting it are very inefficient. And I think the more kind of straightforward way of putting it are that, they're kind of embedded in various kind of systems of interest and corruption. I think that's partially cultivated or sustained by the fact that there's a very opaque regime of who is permitted to import refined petroleum, all managed by the NNPC, which is at one hand, or was at least, on one hand, the regulator in the oil industry, and on the other hand was a player, was a participant, buying, or importing or permitting the importation of refined products, while also, supposedly overseeing the entire sector. So, I mean, that's kind of,
Just to add on a third aspect is also that the NNPC also owns the refineries that don't work. So,
right.
And
yes.
And there's an explicit interest in not maintaining and keeping the
indeed
capacity of the refineries in place because the subsidy. So there's a kind of inbuilt problem in the system here.
Absolutely. At the very least, quite a dramatic conflict of interests. Um, I mean, so before I hand off to Emeka, I guess there's another part of that question I was trying to tack on initially that I'd be interested in hearing your reflections on, and it's basically, or it basically concerns the legacy of
Oh,
Occupy. So yeah, I wonder how you'd reflect on that now, so many
mm,
years after the fact. Like did Occupy, so you're saying that there were some particularities to Occupy. Of course there had been subsidy protests before, but there's sort of participation of this kind of new generation was perhaps one unique aspect. But yeah, I wonder how you would consider the legacies of Occupy, sort of, looking back on it so many years after the fact.
yes. I wrote a full article about this where I
Mm,
say, on the one hand, I think the impact has been underestimated in the narrative. Oh, we had a protest and nothing really happened.
right. Yeah.
Uh, where I think the direct impact on politics and policies are have been huge.
Hmm.
For
Okay.
example, I tend to quote a Nigerian scholar in Canada who says about the earlier protests that the impact of labor protests have been remarkable.
Hmm.
Basically saying that we have the most powerful actors internationally and nationally wanting to remove the subsidies, but the
Hmm.
protests have effectively resisted that removal over time and consistently, and therefore
Mm.
also resisted deregulation of the downstream sector in Nigeria. That in itself is quite huge.
Sure. Sure.
And and we tend to forget that even though the subsidies came back, it was
Right.
never realistic that it would come back to the same prices because of this price mechanism that I talked about.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just unrealistic.
Mm.
So that is one thing. And
Okay.
I also think it had a direct impact on the 2015 elections
Mm.
with this
Hmm.
new sense of agency in parts of civil society that
Yeah.
contributed to the merger of into APC,
Yeah. Sure.
and in many ways invigorated the campaign of the opposition, which led
Hmm.
to the first election in Nigerian history where an opposition party wins in a civil election,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
in Buhari. The campaign was about change. It's literally reflected a lot of the wordings of the street in 2012, etc.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
I think there are some institutional impacts that tends to be underestimated.
Yeah.
I think also the youth campaign of not too young to vote and all these things also sprang out of this agency that came with youth. But there's kind of a contradictory impact too, which is a disappointment
Yeah.
of
Sure.
things not happening that led to a lot of apathy
Hmm.
because the impacts weren't sensed big enough. And I think this is partly related to how we talk about it, but this sense of something big about to happen, and then it also contracts before your eyes. But
Yeah.
maybe also from a kind of social movement perspective,
Hmm.
it this what I think is a fragmentation in civil society, and the what in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, for where labor was kind of the voice of civil society, the
Hmm.
and of democracy, etc. Suddenly that position was challenged in during Occupy,
Sure.
where
Yeah.
other actors claimed ownership to
Mm.
subsidies and of the protest and voicing the I don't know, the common Nigerian
Yeah. Yeah.
and and this kind of difference in ideas of representation and the role of labor, that
Hmm.
fragmentation, I would like to hear your reflection
Mm.
on. But my
Yeah.
impression is that instead of bridging that after 2012, it has been cemented, and the division is almost worse than it was then.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
yeah,
For
and
sure.
maybe also I think it generally from me being a kind of a labor person and interested in
Mhm.
labor specifically, I think it also highlighted very, very high expectations on labor that is not
Yeah,
necessarily rooted in a realistic idea about the power and potential and capabilities of labor.
sure.
And then maybe also labor changed its strategy,
Yeah,
maybe. Or did it?
right. That's literally our next question to you. So, I mean, I'll let Emeka phrase it in a moment. But just to say, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I think your reflections on
yeah.
how Occupy was like kind of, I don't know, like um a sort of moment of reckoning in the relationship
Mm,
between labor and the broader civil society, and it kind of created rifts that haven't necessarily been healed and might kind of have hardened actually since then.
mm,
Is spot on. I think that definitely reflects, like my own analysis anyway of what's happened since then, and yeah, maybe Emeka's as well.
mm.
Hmm. Wow. Thanks again, Camilla, for you know joining us today for this episode. And I must say that just listening to you, okay. I should thank you rather, for your responses and insights into some of the issues. Um, I'd start by saying that I found your um what's the word now, the difference that you try to make about agency and power of the labor unions, quite interesting.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah.
and I'm kind of drawn to connecting that to um this inbuilt price mechanisms that you talked about, especially in more um developed countries who've had to deal with resistance to subsidy removal, or just generally subsidy removal itself. you,
Hmm.
but I don't know. um Perhaps maybe I should also try and answer that question about June 12. Sorry, I said June 12.
Freudian slip.
Um yeah, the occupy the occupy the Occupy movement, the
Yeah.
Yeah.
protest of 212. I think that to speak to the question that you pose about the fragmentation, I think that one thing to say, or that is useful to say about that protest, is that it's something about the coalition that made it possible,
Right.
where even though the labor unions play a substantive role, um, there's also the role that was played by the then opposition, in terms of political parties.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
it's useful to the extent that, as we speak today, the then
Mm.
opposition is now in government, and the guys who've gone on to actually yank subsidies totally,
Mm,
basically. you know
Hmm.
um so yeah,
Hmm.
that fragmentation has come full circle, if you like.
Right. Yeah.
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 um yeah, even though that some of the major players have left the scene, especially on yeah, on both parts, on both the labor union side and the opposition, or I mean, um the guys who have now taken subsidy off the table. But
Right.
Mm,
that's kind of my inroad into asking, first by saying that I don't know how you'd respond to the feeling, So I don't want to say general feeling, but it's kind of the feeling in Nigeria, right now that the labor movement, labor unions have slowly adjusted, their stance to subsidy removal. By that, that's sheer resistance. And that it's been a gradual thing since 2012, to more emphasis on local refining capacity and alternatives to petrol, mostly around talk regarding compressed natural gas as well as the auto gas alternatives, So I guess my question is, if you agree that this shift has happened or is happening, how would you then think of the shift itself? I don't know if you can help us, reason.
I have my perspectives, but that's not necessarily the full on. But I think I'll throw one question back to you, Emeka, which you can think about when I reflect, because I think one of the big changes since 2012 is the popular ideas about subsidies. And you also mentioned in the last episode that whereas in 2012 you were in the streets and against the removal, whereas now you're more ambivalent. And my sense is that is a very common thinking among people, and a lot of actors that were on the streets in 2012 supported the removal already in 2016 when the prices changed. So I think, especially on kind of the political thinkers, and that there's a change. So before I say something about labor, I think that there's something happening in the political landscape. Up until the Buhari time, all politicians in opposition were against the removal, and all sitting politicians wanted to remove. And that was part of the political dance. And when the opposition came into power, they changed their mind and wanted to remove. There's an interesting thing with Buhari, who actually insisted on, up until the last days, that he was not for removing, but he had to remove or adjust prices because so he had a different kind of rhetoric than earlier presidents on this. But this election also highlighted that all the bigger political players wanted to remove the subsidies. It was not a popularity contest of the opposition to get the support of the votes through supporting subsidies. That is kind of the first major election where that happens, as I understand it. So there's a change in ideas, and remembering that Tinubu, he was part of the Occupy 2012. He talked about this removal as a breach of a social contract. Buhari was against it. There was a lot of the APC people who were against it, and who they all changed their mind. And I think it's not just an elite change, but that doesn't mean that it's not felt on the ground, the price, but the ambivalence about the subsidy and the structures, the politics, the corruption. It's becoming more and more difficult to support the subsidy because it's associated more and more with, for instance, corruptions. And my friend Isaac Kosuoka from the Social Action wrote a piece about the one of the other effects of 2012, the exposure of corruption. Even though all Nigerians knew that the subsidy was associated with corruption, the size and sheer hugeness of it was seen as surprising when the Lawal commission came up with its findings and all the associated things around that. So, and I think there are some things that are also very different in 2023 compared to 2012 that are relevant for context. Whereas 2012 came in a boom period. Nigeria was seen as, I mean, all kind of growth numbers went up on a macro level.
But the Africa rising period.
Exactly.
It was the Africa rising, and everyone expected Nigeria to be the next emerging economy, and there was a lot of investments and expectations. But the people in Nigeria generally didn't feel it. The inequality was on the rise, and poverty was on the rise. So that context in itself is extremely potent when it comes to resistance. Today, there's recession, inflation, economic crisis, state budgets are inflated and something needs to be done. So, and apathy is higher. I think to protest, you need to have a sense that it makes a difference to protest. So there's a context that is more difficult, the economy is more difficult, and there's this apathy and sense of the subsidy scheme is just, I don't know, it seems like it's not this kind of social and economic right and a benefit for people in the same way, at least not as simple as it may have felt before. So this is, of course, kind of exaggerating and still not wanting to say that it's not super important to the economy. So now, after all that, I come to labor. I don't think labor has changed that much.
Okay.
So in terms, because all the things that you say, this focus on the refinery, the minimum wage, all these things have been with labor since forever. And when I interviewed people about the 2012, what they wanted out of the negotiations, etc., they were quite clear that, and even Osho during his NLC days was kind of open to privatization and deregulation in itself, but it was a question of how and on what terms it should be, with dialogue processes, especially with labor, but in democratic processes. And instead of the idea that the IMF and political leaders saying that, well, we can cushion this by other kind of welfare benefits. You know, there was the Sure P program back then. So labor said, well, enough. You may remove a subsidy, but we will not accept it before we see it. It must be in place before we can accept. So they've said that also 10, 15 years back. But somehow it was not so obvious in the public, but in the NLC documents and in my interviews with labor, this has pretty much been the same. So there has been more of an ambivalence in labor all the time.
So then it's kind of been a sequencing question. Like, if
so
you're
for
going
me,
to remove it,
what you describe as different is not necessarily different. What I would say is different is that there has been a leadership change from an extremely charismatic and powerful leader who knew how to navigate the system with Osho, and when there was not a lot of challenges from other civil society, to maybe a less strong leadership. Just coming from the public sector means that you have less negotiating capacity than if you come from the private sector in Nigeria, when you talk about kind of the individual capacity of leading a protest or a negotiation process. And a lot of the people who were kind of hands-on in the first decade of this century, they are not necessarily hands-on or in the union movement. But there has also been a long-term weakening of the unions with pressure from outside on labor rights and harassment and loss of membership and structures, etc., etc. So I think my impression is also when you and this is what my impression, that there has been a time where the NLC has not necessarily prioritized kind of the social movement side of itself as much as it used to be during the 80s and 90s, and somehow ambivalently also for a while, that because also engaging in this huge social protest is resource demanding, and some voices within the labor will say, well, the key here is not necessarily to secure price of consumption, but to ensure working condition and salaries.
Yeah, sure.
Because this battle is extremely resource demanding, so it would make more sense of to focus on the more core labor issue. However, labor is also seemingly very ambivalent on this because of their weakness to actually protect salaries and income levels of their members or the general Nigerian income levels.
Yeah.
But when they can't do that, this subsidy protest has also kept the Nigerian union relevant in times of weakening. So there's something about what is the importance of subsidy and social protest to the unions, not necessarily only the other way around. So I think unions have kept relevant through this, not least because they have not been able to lift workers properly for a long time. So there's a very difficult relationship here. Does that make sense, or is it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a lot to chew on. And in trying to chew on it, I mean, for the benefit of our listeners mostly, I think the question that springs from that, would be to ask if, because of this ambivalence that you speak of, where the unions find themselves, today, maybe like say a decade or less than 2 years, but a decade, roughly about a decade after the leadership of Oshiomhole, who would later go on to become a governor of his own state. And where we are now, the transition in between and where we are now with present leadership of the union, and the difference in context, between 2012 and 2023. The sense I get, or the feeling I get, is that I mean, this is not something you said, but I think that you kind of provide some kind of justification for why perhaps the labor unions are placing more emphasis on the alternatives, the petrol, such as auto gas, compressed natural gas, and then hammering down on the refining capacity of the Nigerian state, with the refineries. I think that some of that is also a pushback against the fact that even the central bank has or the central bank under its former leadership decided to kind of subsidize, private refineries like the Dangote one.
Sure.
Yeah, so um, I guess, I mean, that's kind of the context within which we find ourselves increasingly in 2023. And so perhaps I think my question is I mean, it's perhaps it's probably the big question here. Is Nigeria's petrol subsidy still worth fighting for, do you think? Especially from the point of view that the tactics of the union is not something that everyday Nigerians recognize. Because I say that bearing in mind that popular public opinion seems to think, and this has been the case for some time, at least in the last decade, that labor unions have sold out.
Yeah. Can I just, because you said that I provided some kind of justification for the labor process of refinery focus, I try to say that I don't think the policies have changed as much as many things. I don't know, I'm supposed to be a researcher, so I'm not supposed to have personal opinions, but in this context, I think I can.
Very much so.
I think the focus on refineries as kind of the leverage point is a very short-sighted and insufficient one. I don't get why. I understand this idea of rebuilding the refineries to have good old-fashioned value added in Nigeria instead of this absurd situation of sending raw oil out and having refined products in. That is absurd.
Yes.
So I do not think that the unions, when they say that if we have our own refineries, there will be no subsidies, but prices will be cheap. I think that is not how the economy works.
Right.
Nigeria is part of a capitalist society where market prices defines this. So if the refineries work, there will be value added in Nigeria, but the prices for the consumers, there's nothing in the open market economy that says that the price at the pump will be cheaper. I don't get that at all. I don't think it makes sense. And there's another thing that because there's a tendency to talk about what labor does. But and Said and me, we've been talking a lot about this in other contexts, that there's a lot of expectation to labor, but very little engagement with labor. And that is both in terms of having conversations with labor, but not least getting into labor, organizing, being part of labor.
Yeah, sure.
In the 80s and the 90s, the academic and intellectual capacity in the academic unions and in the student movement was absolutely key in the strategizing and making labor what it is. Where are the students and academics and the intellectuals in engaging with the unions now? There are individuals out there, but it's not as big and systematic. And we also have the collapse of the educational system. But there's still, I've talked to so many Nigerians who are disappointed with the unions, but so few of them talk to the unions or even become members of the unions.
Yeah, sure.
So there's an organizational thing that is also, I think, the biggest opportunity after 2012 was taken by the political parties and not by civil society and the left. So that's one thing. But Emeka, you mentioned also the subsidies on the production side to Dangote, and I think that is also extremely important to keep in mind that both internationally and in many countries, there are so much subsidies for production that we never talk about. That is literally, I mean, if you also talked about this last time about how we frame this consumer fuel subsidies as something benefiting the rich. Subsidizing production and building refineries with Dangote, that is benefiting the rich. And there's
absolutely
there's a mind-blowing lack of talk about it globally, internationally. I've been reading IMF and World Bank reports and I don't know how much, but it's all of them define fuel subsidies as production subsidies, consumption subsidies, and some of them also talk about kind of the subsidies indirectly via the cost of the impact of fossil combustion.
Yeah.
But somehow the production subsidies disappears from the rest of the analysis.
Yeah, I wonder why.
It's quite consistent.
Maybe deliberately.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think admitting that quote unquote capitalism requires these constant huge injections of capital from the state might be a little embarrassing for some people. So maybe that's why.
Especially in oil.
Yes. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So now I feel I forgot to, but I think, the changes in labor, if you look at the documents of the strategic documents of how NLC defines itself, there is not as direct reference to being the voice of the people, representing beyond its members, being kind of a social movement beyond labor. It still says that that's the aim, but in more indirect forms, and it's more focused on being a labor. But that's a two-way thing. It comes partly from how labor defines things themselves, but also the expectations, this ambivalence towards labor, that they should be there for the larger society, but there's also a distrust and so they don't claim as much voice as before, and they're not giving as much I don't know, acceptance as representatives from the outside. So I think there's a
So I mean, would I be right to suggest that you're saying that because of its limitations, it's probably not even fighting for petrol subsidy for the mass of the Nigerian people?
No, I think that would be taking it too far. Well, I don't know. I don't know about the motivation in the head of Joe Aguero when he says that they want to protest on behalf of. I think this legacy of social movement is still with the NLC and other unions.
Sure.
Certainly, when you talk to them and when you read what they say, I can only relate to what they say, not understand what they think. But to say that they have left that idea, I think they haven't left it. But it's somehow more moderate, whereas the new president is more directly open about having that kind of role. But I think it's more when we talk about the difference between agency and power, I think there's still a certain will, but some changes to how they formulate and define themselves, but not as much as kind of the large conversation of disappointments in unions. But I think there is the long-term pressure on labor through liberalization and reorganization of system and bashing on their rights and going after them is underestimated. And I think for unions to play the expected role, they need to be re-empowered. And that has to do with people actually being members and being part, including the intellectual society in Nigeria. So there's high expectations. So I think there's there's an ambivalence here on where I think in many ways labor delivers more than they're being credited for, but they're also less powerful than they are expected to be.
Mm.
And I think that is labor's kind of summed up difficult situation. And that is
Yeah.
not only in Nigeria. I think this could be almost any country.
Yeah, sure. Well said.
You know, when you talk about, I mean, back this, I don't want to draw this out, too long, but I just use it and then move on to one final question. Rather, I'll just pose it and then move on. So this is basically like my own opinion. I think that the idea that labor doesn't have power or as much power as it used to have is valid, especially from the point of view of how it replenishes its base. There are people going into the unions, be they intellectuals, be they workers, across board within different sectors. But I think that over time, and this owes to a lot of economic decisions that that have been made in the past. But over time, part of why labor's power has been weakened is not so much the fact that people don't engage with labor in terms of joining up. I mean that exists if you ask me, but I think that labor's ability to I don't want to say draw blood, but labor's ability to effectively resist power,
leverage
of the state, is limited to the energy industry, to oil and maybe gas, right? Increasingly in its response to other kinds of strike, whether be they by doctors, academic staff union of ASU or all of that. That really the government's attitude is that they don't care, and then the only reason why they actually do care about energy, especially oil, as we speak today, is because that's the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. That's what really gives. That's where they get revenue from. So a labor strike any day, anytime, under the most useless of leaders within that industry will cause severe havoc to both their own interests and the larger Nigerian economy. And I think that part of how government exemplifies it, or one way that they did this last time, was to go to court. And this is something that perhaps we talked about in the last episode, and Said's response is that this is shock therapy, but I also think that it's evident in the ways that the present government tries to shape public opinion. So then it becomes a question of at what point would people get tired, really? So I guess that, not to answer my own question, but I guess that yes, from that point of view, there's probably something worth fighting from, from the standpoint of the labor unions, because chances are that protests or resistance to this current regime of fuel subsidy removal would probably go on with or without organized labor.
Right.
So I guess that's my own take on it.
Well, if I could just jump in there, I mean, I guess so.
Okay.
I mean, is this? I guess. I mean, Camilla sort of seemed to maybe dance around the question a little bit. So so I kind of wonder, I mean, how should you address it head on? Like, having heard you phrase it that way, as like the subsidy is worth fighting for because it still asserts, or it's one of the ways in which labor remains relevant. Like, I wonder if you would endorse that phrasing as well, Camilla, like that, the subsidy is worth fighting for partially because, it keeps labor relevant, or do you feel like it's a little more complicated?
I think it's always more complicated. But ideally, if I would run Nigeria, I think I would.
Be our guest.
I would keep the subsidy and fight for it, partly to use it as a leverage to build something else. And that part is as complicated as the fuel subsidy itself. How should we trust the leaders? How should we trust anything to happen? And I completely sympathize with the idea of, as long as there's nothing else on the table, when there's no alternative energy, when there's no electricity, when there's no welfare system, at least we have cheap fuel. And it's up to the elites. And I think I interviewed one of the researchers in the Ghana TUC, because they have also had the rounds of fuel subsidy, not as powerful as in Nigeria, but they've had the same thing.
Sure.
And I presented the same kind of arguments of, well, but it's eating up the budgets and it's blah, 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 blah. And he said, well, we have a simple answer to that. Tax the rich. And because there's a lack of a conversation on how do we provide welfare. And I understand and sympathize with the idea, let's keep the cheap fuel until we have welfare. Then the question is, how do we build a welfare system here? I don't know, in 2012, the fuel subsidies took up 1/3 of the state budget. That's enormous.
Sure.
And part of the argument to remove it is because it's so enormous and it could be used better. The answer from the street was like, well, if you just remove the corruption, we can still keep the subsidy, because most of that part of the 1/3 of the budget is going into elites' pockets, not necessarily in. So there's a fundamental and extremely difficult thing at the bottom of this. So the subsidy has been a way of labor to be relevant, but it is also relevant for normal Nigerians whose real income, whether they're formal or informal sector, change overnight. And it's also important to remember that the middle classes that are supposedly the main beneficiaries of the subsidies, they will normally have compensation for increased subsidies. I talked to the trade unionist working in the Norwegian state oil company. He said that they even had it in the collective bargaining agreement in Pengasan at that company to get extra salary when fuel prices increased. But ordinary workers won't have that. So
and I mean, in addition, there are all these so-called palliatives announced. I mean, in a lot of cases, there's support for businesses. I mean, Tinubu's whole speech like a couple of weeks ago was all about support for businesses, which I'm not criticizing that in and of itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything for the vast majority of people, particularly people working in the informal sector.
And it's also interesting because in Norway, in the US, and in Europe, there's a definite move towards state intervention in the economy and the need to build private sector in energy transition. And if that also happens in Nigeria, this increased subsidies and a continued idea that we have to have growth because before we can share, that's crazy. in a
Mm-hmm.
Nigerian context, there's so many rich people. There's enough to share. There's enough to
Yeah.
share. At least a
Yeah.
little bit more. That may be a
Yeah.
bit kind of not very refined argument, but
No, but yeah, you won't
yeah.
find very many people disagreeing with you on this
Mm.
on this show. And I mean, moreover, the other point of that is, I mean, the cost cannot continue to be borne disproportionately by some of the world's poorest people. Like that just can't
And
be the model.
that's basically what's happening. And from
Exactly.
that, so in a way, whether or not it's worthwhile to keep the subsidies, the short term is that the not keeping the subsidy is a problem for poor households.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees on that. IMF,
Mm-hmm.
World Bank, everyone says this, but they say it and they move on. So and they talk about palliatives and basic income grants and all kinds of possible things. And they tend to forget to mention that the reason why the subsidies are removed is to save money. It is not a rebudgeting exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So if it was a rebudgeting exercise, fair and well,
Yeah.
have an open
Yeah.
citizen dialogue on what to do with those money. But that's
Yeah.
not the case here. It's to save
Mm-hmm.
money.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
That's interesting. That you raise that point. Where but I think that there are a couple of people that I might not necessarily agree with, who would argue that perhaps in this instance that the framing of the issue of subsidy removal in Nigeria is kind of like a rebudgeting uh, exercise, where you save money and then you channel it elsewhere. There are those who have argued, I mean, perhaps maybe even all of the major political parties that went into the last election, that
Yeah, but
channel.
if you look at the budget talks of all these political parties, they're talking about saving money, and the one big budget post to save is subsidies. And then they talk about some of this being used as palliatives and cushioning, but all of them agree that it's about saving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It has
I mean, I
always
agree.
been the case. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, they
yeah.
even go beyond just palliatives, even though that's where I'm coming to. They kind of say that, oh, that money can be channeled into education, it could be channeled into health, it could be channeled into infrastructure development. They always say, oh, we save money, but this is where we can put it, and then that helps grows, the economy. The palliative, because I like to differentiate between palliative and intervention. So I guess that what I want to speak more to is the intervention, but there's also always the palliative as stopgap measure, because I think it's always clear to the ruling class that whatever policy changes, that the what's it called, that the fallout of a policy change like subsidy removal would be catastrophic, and then simply to buy time, that's where they come up with the palliatives, and then run narratives around why you should give them some time, especially and some time till basically they're able to have transitioned into what kind of interventions that they want to pursue. Part of that intervention, as we speak, is a transition from fossil fuel to alternatives like auto gas, and then compressed natural gas. And part of their own argument for this lies with the emphasis of its environmental benefit. So I wonder how, as a final question from me, how you would respond to criticisms of petrol subsidies in the developing world, and I mean in this instance Nigeria, the kind of critique that emphasizes, these environmental benefits of much more cleaner energy, as one of, or the major incentive for, the removal of subsidy fuel. Even though, I mean, it's obvious that we don't contribute the highest to, carbon emissions,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the short version is that I've been criticizing, because this kind of the environmental argument has also ended up with left people in the global north, including in Norway, supporting subsidy removal because that makes sense. And they buy into the idea that the subsidies kind of build up under and continues support and upholds an industry that is deeply problematic for our ecology and for the environment and for the long-term survival of the planet, basically.
Yeah.
And I understand somehow that, but my problem is that many of them kind of insist on not acknowledging, because they also tend to insist on this. It's the elites and the upper middle classes that benefits. And it's also different to the rhetoric used in these countries. Like, we've had protests against increased fuel prices in a lot of global north countries, including in Norway. And then suddenly it's important to acknowledge the detrimental effect on the poorer household, and we should cushion and have processes and come up with alternative politics. Whereas it's dismissed when we talk about the global south. It's like we change our glasses when we talk about things happening far away. I don't know. And so I think it's deeply unproblematic, especially when it is combined with a lack of focus on production subsidies. I mean, the global left and the environmental movement is also against subsidizing production, but it's because all these huge institutions that writes, I mean, there's a humongous production of academic and policy reports from the International Energy Agency, IMF, the OECD, you name it, you'll find a report on this, arguing for removing inefficient subsidies. And they also argue that it is in the interest of the poor and development to do so. But they don't have kind of a sufficient understanding of the details, and that is very frustrating. And you'll even find that last year, when we had the increased energy prices, including fuel prices, in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, the IMF goes out in Europe and say, now we need to consider the poor because all these energy price increases is a problem for the poor. There's a story here that is very, very problematic, and you will see that the Guardian, that has now a lot of focus on climate journalism, they love to report these numbers of this humongous subsidies happening. And as opposed to most other subsidies, in this context, they tend to include numbers for the cost of the indirect impact of fossil combustion. So the cost of treating health issues because of respiratory problems, climate change, health, security, all these, the numbers are so high you'll be dizzy. I think the World Bank talks about $6 trillion in indirect subsidies, which means
Okay.
the cost of the impact of fossil industry combustion, blah, 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 blah. And those numbers float around. And for some reason, it's pointed basically to the subsidy of consumption. And the World Bank forgot to mention the subsidy of production of oil, though they mentioned the subsidy of fertilizers in the agricultural sector. But I couldn't find the numbers. So there's inequality in how we talk about these things that is deeply problematic, I think. And when it comes to environment, I have tried to, this is not a kind of broad research, but just a sense. I talked to several of my friends in the environmental organizations in Nigeria and I asked them how they felt about the fuel subsidies in Nigeria, given that it is supposed to uphold and maintain a deeply problematic industry. And I've yet to come across anyone who supports removal of the subsidies because they say, well, in the short term, this is so important socially for our people that we need the subsidies. Maybe in the long term, but short term, even the environmentalists don't support removing the subsidies. So,
yeah, interesting. And I think quite helpful because you bring the question of justice in a way back on the table, right? I think which is crucial and which I think is all too easily sidestepped by people who want to emphasize the various benefits, that removals can bring both in developmental terms and in budgetary terms without talking about the unequal distribution of suffering that would result from these kinds of policies. So, listen.
Can I just quickly say a factual thing?
Sure.
Because when you mentioned, America, that the moving away from fossil to natural gas is also a fossil. But
True.
My own country has been lobbying the European Union to accept natural gas as green. But it is a fossil energy source as well, but it's slightly less impactful in its consumption than oil and coal. So Nigeria has the same kind of approach as my own country to accept natural gas as slightly better than oil. But the renewable industry with solar, wind, hydropower, I mean, that's the future. And Nigeria will have a problem in the long run if there's no transition, and that will also be a problem for the poor and for the industry in general. I mean, the future is green, so there should be a plan to transition somehow. The green is pretty far away still, unfortunately. But
No, that's a fair point. So there's some fudging of definitions that seems to be happening. So I guess Nigeria will probably want to hope that the fudging of definitions continues indefinitely.
Our countries are on the same page here.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Maybe we have to do an edition on the Norwegian scam. But yeah, that won't be today because we've taken up quite a bit of your time already, for which we should say thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, I suppose that's probably the best place to wrap up. Moments before a new general strike is announced. I think this will probably come out before that. I think you've provided a lot of insights for us today on thinking through these questions, and I hope we can call you back at another point to talk some more.
Thank you so much.
Isn't there a warning strike already?
Yeah, that's it. It's the warning strike I was referring to. Sorry, that has been teased. Yeah, so we'll see if it will be more of an Occupy or more of the strikes that happened before Occupy. And yeah, it would be good at that point perhaps to have another conversation. But I suppose we should probably leave it here for today.